So Russia often gets its way without empire, to a certain extent. But then the question is, will Central Asia invite Russia to become an imperial power again? Empires don't have to be built by force. They can often, and they are often built by invitation. In the early 1990s, auto-colonization, this self-colonization, seemed possible. From the point of view of the periphery, they needed security and economic stability. Things were pretty bad, especially with Tajikistan and Afghanistan, and with the plummeting economies. But the elites became increasingly committed to formal independence once they got the hang of it, and they also weren't dumb. They knew that they risked losing power if they invited the Russians in. So therefore they tried to balance out Russian interests with those of other states, which were a safety valve, other states that were also interested in being partners with Central Asia. This would also come with high costs for Russia, of course, becoming a new imperial power. You need great financial resources to support any sort of empire. You need strong military resources, and this is a time when Russia was quite poor and the military was falling apart. Now, of course, when oil tripled in price a decade later, this became arguably much easier, more politically feasible. But it was also less necessary. So you got to think of short-term versus long-term considerations. Central Asian states have had a constant rocking motion to and from Russia, back and forth. But they've always jealously guarded their independence at the end of the day. So Russia has really been what we can call a borderline hegemon. It has the disproportionate means to manipulate, but it's also got these, and these could involve semi-coercive mechanisms. Like, for example, issue linkages, retaliation through trade, but not force. Right? Well, you can cut off your gas supply lines, so you can't get these things to market. Your oil supply lines, your cotton. If all the roads go through Moscow, you've got capabilities that don't involve force that you can use. Note also that Russia has troops in the region. It has an airbase in Kant in Kyrgyzstan and several military bases in Tajikistan, including Dushanbe and Kulab. It also has a military presence in Kazakhstan, where it runs radar stations and where its space program is also based. Russia perhaps could be considered a borderline hegemon because it presses for a foreign policy that agrees with its own. But this frequently draws visceral reactions by Central Asian elites who are trying to guard their own autonomy. And Russia has not used its military to press for changes, at least not yet, anywhere in Central Asia except in a civil war era Tajikistan. Although, as I mentioned before, Russia's incursion into Georgia in 2008 can be seen as a warning of a new rising Russia. And so this borderline hegemon concept sort of remains up here. In the end, Russia's lack of military intervention in Central Asia today may be for lack of a key contentious issue, or because it feels it has the reins tight enough through current mechanisms like the Commonwealth of Independent States. The Commonwealth of Independent States really was the Russian reincarnation in Central Asia, but it was problematic from the start. So Central Asians, as you recall, were struck at the loss of the Soviet Union. They came together in Ashgabat, Turkmenistan, to discuss reactions to the Minsk Declaration, the Slavic alliance. And on December 12, 1991, they met along with Azerbaijan, which is a Turkic-speaking state from the Caucasus, to discuss this. But any new union was already being questioned on various fronts. In Kazakhstan, Nazarbayev was very much pro. He always wanted to keep the Soviet Union alive. The ethnic consideration for him was huge. There were Russians who might want to secede, so it's better for all of us to work together. In Uzbekistan, Karimov was also pro-alliance, economic insecurity. Right? Think of the Tajik situation, Afghanistan right on Uzbekistan's borders. In Tajikistan, you had a dying regime that was pro. It was unclear what preferences the opposition would have, or would have been, but likely they also would have been pro given the economic situation. In Turkmenistan, fairly anti-CIS. They didn't join the CIS because they opted for bilateral ties with Russia instead. They had a policy of what they call positive neutrality, although they are now associate members, or they were, I should say, between 91 and 2005, they were associate members of the CIS. So they didn't join, but they sort of like to watch. Kyrgyzstan was also anti-CIS. They wanted their neutrality as well. They thought that they could be Central Asia's little Switzerland, friendly with everybody. Soon they saw, though, that they needed to work closely with Russia and the old bloc to make the economic reforms happen, and also for security. I should say that even Turkmenistan, which avoided entering the CIS formally at first, pressed for Russian cooperation with respect to security. This was an issue of capabilities and needs. Note that Turkmenistan has focused more on the world market than the others have. Um, and so they've also been less likely to sign on to CIS agreements. Belarus, which is less involved in the world market, for example, and much more dependent on Russia, is much closer in the CIS. It's sort of Russia's right hand, really left because they're on the other side of the map, partner. Azerbaijan also joined the CIS. Again, this was an issue of dependence, but also needed to get oil to market through Russia. So might as well get in here. Note also that those who did not necessarily prefer the CIS entered as a result of Russian heavy-handedness. Georgia was part of it for a while. Ukraine was also part of it. Ukraine in the fall of 2013 stepped away from negotiations that would move it closer to the EU for the same reason. You had economic threats from Russia. If you don't come closer to us, then we're going to sabotage your economy now. And the EU couldn't compensate for this. And this has led to a major crisis in the Ukraine. The Baltics were the only ones to stay far clear of the CIS as a result of their proximity to and movement towards the European Union. But the rest of the states largely came into the CIS. Note the primary consideration for each of these states in joining the CIS was based on Russia. It was understood that despite promises of sovereignty and equality, this wasn't going to be an equal partnership. By early 1992, all of them had joined the CIS except for the Baltics. In reality, the CIS was a tool for Russia to remain active in the policies of each of these countries. Indirectly, often, this sphere of influence idea. But the CIS has been a huge disappointment. It's been referred to as, quote, a graveyard of several hundreds of agreements signed and then dead or frozen at birth. The result is that CIS issues are frequently resolved on a bilateral basis. Russia, basically, with each one of its post-Soviet republic buddies, dealing with everything from trade to security. The major exception, though, is between Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, which I'll address in a few minutes, which came together in a customs union. So what went wrong? Why has the CIS failed so badly, given all these sort of positive moves towards it? Well, the first is a lack of purpose. Its goals from the start were unclear. There were also lots of tensions. How to deal with post-Soviet property. Russia took on the Soviet debt. Shouldn't it get property too then? All the Soviet property in all these places? It's complicated. If Russia gets all the tanks back, it still can't get all the buildings back, can it? Or can it? Ooh. Imagine Russia trying to take back the buildings, right? We took all the Soviet Union's debt, so maybe we should take back all the buildings and sell them to, privatize them, and we should be the beneficiaries. A second issue here is that each successor state seems to have a different understanding of the CIS mission and the character it should have. Everyone in the region accepts that it's transitional, that it should be the stepping stone towards something. But beyond that, it was really unclear. Transition to what? Some, especially those closer to Europe, envisioned it as a, quote, civilized means to divorce, to deal with lingering issues in the 1990s, and then it would die away. In the meantime, it would maintain some degree of capacities that the new state still lacked. Economic functions, military, border patrol functions. So that was supposed to be its purpose for some of them. Others, though, saw these functions as the beginning of something much broader, much more authoritative and long-standing. Most Central Asian states, especially led by Nazarbayev, hoped that the CIS would evolve into a permanent, tightly knit organization. And again, more on that in a minute. But even these states had lingering fears of a return to the Soviet era. It goes back to the role of nationalism. All these states were weary of a return to empire where Moscow would again be in charge. And this leads to inherent tensions in an organization where Moscow is truly in charge. Russia also didn't see this as a permanent integrated institution, by the way. But it was also weary of limiting its own actions in economic or security spheres, of overcommitment. But it has been it has seen the CIS as a tool to legitimize and institutionalize its influence in much of the post-Soviet world. Now, finally, there have been significant tensions because of the huge weight carried by Russia, and the frequency with which Russia acts unilaterally in various spheres, which has led many proponents of the CIS to sort of alternate between praising it and condemning it. This very ambiguous position. Some of them, Uzbekistan, keeps coming and going. Another factor here is assistance. If Russia wants to be the big player in the new system, it has to pay in. And for much of the CIS's existence, Russia has been unwilling or unable to provide economic assistance to the countries in its new bloc. For example, remember that they dismantled the ruble zone. They forced countries to produce their own currency. Well, this isn't a great way to gain favor for the CIS. So here's some examples of failure. The first one is the ruble zone. This marked really the first period of CIS collaborations, the ruble zone. Central Asia was in on this. The ruble would be the currency for domestic and intra-CIS transactions. So trade between Kyrgyzstan and Belarus, for example, would be in rubles. Trade between Kyrgyzstan and Ukraine, which didn't sign on to this, would be in dollars or Deutschmarks. And remember, dollars, hard currency, is much more difficult for them to get. So they're not going to trade as much with the Ukraine. So it's in everyone's interest to sign on to this. The Russian central bank was tasked with providing enough rubles to the central banks of each of the participating states to satisfy currency demands. In exchange, those countries had to limit their own credit expansion and set up uniform lending rates so that there wouldn't be a run on the ruble in any particular given state. The problem is that there was no enforcement mechanism for this. So you had a huge dispersion of inflation rates, which made this untenable. The dream of an interstate bank of the CIS really died as Russia released a new currency, going from the Soviet ruble to the Russian ruble, and excluded all the others. This, again, was back in 1993. Another example of tensions here was security of CIS failures. The CIS established in mid-1992 a treaty on collective security, and it included Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. It was heavily, disproportionately Central Asian. The only reason Armenia got in there was because it needed promises of assistance should the Turks take up an aggressive position with them in regard to their own conflict with Azerbaijan. Azerbaijanis being Turkic peoples. In 1993, Georgia and Belarus also joined this treaty on collective security. Collective security was weak, though. This was a function of sovereignty being jealously guarded in each one of these states. Signatories promised to consult on important security matters, like provide mutual assistance in case of attack, but the treaty was good for only 5 years, and then it could be renewed. It wasn't a long-standing treaty like NATO had been. Signatories were also initially weary of Russia, which was unwilling to limit its own freedom of action. Indeed, the Russian parliament refused to ratify it at first, saying it was too rigid. But by the end of 1993, the Russians ratified the treaty based on this idea that the collective security treaty would serve as a legal base for Russian interference in the near abroad. And this was terrifying. Signatories were hesitant, since this was clearly not a new Eastern NATO, a partnership of some equality. For example, the U.S. is at the top of NATO, but Great Britain and France, they've also got nukes and strong militaries. The same couldn't be said of collective security members. The only really powerful one was Russia. Georgia and Uzbekistan withdrew from this in 1999, but then a year later, Uzbekistan joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is really Central Asia minus Turkmenistan, and then plus Russia and China, and overwhelmingly focused on security and anti-radical Islam. So in other words, the Treaty on Collective Security really died, and a new form was born in something else with China. So Russia was not the hegemon anymore. All this highlights not just concerns with Russia, but also varying intra-CIS conflicts and policy directions. Georgia, for example, can't wait to join NATO. Overall, there are 3 core members of the CIS: Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. Nazarbayev has been such a proponent of the CIS that when it seemed it was failing in 1994, he even proposed a Eurasian Union, like the European Union, but of Central Asia. It would have a single currency. It would be composed of supranational organizations that once their decisions were made would become binding on those of the member states. It would coordinate, make sure that they all had common foreign policies, economic and defense policies as well. The Eurasian Union has been attacked as a liability for new state sovereignty, but the most vicious attacks came from Karimov, who is rivaling for leadership in the region with Nazarbayev. Nazarbayev has also pushed other initiatives that have been more successful, at least with Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. For example, there was a CIS customs union, which created a common trade border. But it was a really measured success up until very lately. So the CIS was largely it was largely nothing. It was largely nothing for most of the member states, except that it was a good platform for a few of those states, in particular Belarus, Russia, and Kazakhstan, and lately Kyrgyzstan, to get on board in a much tighter relationship in the long run.